Look at these children. Look at their faces. Look at their eyes. What you are looking at is not historical abstraction. This is not a statistic. This is not an animated recreation. This is a real photograph taken in 1913 of two real children in a real cotton field in the American South. The girl on the left cannot be more than 7 or 8 years old. Her hands are not yet fully formed. Her body is not ready for the physical demands of agricultural labor. Yet, here she stands, in the intense heat, collecting cotton bolls into a sack that will be weighed and credited against a family debt she will never fully repay. The girl on the right, perhaps 10 or 11, shows signs of years already spent in this work. Her posture is bent. Her expression is resigned. She knows what the day holds. She knows what tomorrow holds. She knows she will not escape this. This photograph was taken 112 years ago. Yet it captures something that remains true today, the deliberate invisibility of agricultural child labor in America. 1.75 million children worked in fields like this one, but their photographs were never taken. Or, if they were taken, they were never preserved. Or, if preserved, they were never shown. Or, if shown, they were never truly seen. This photograph survived. This photograph exists. This photograph demands to be seen. This photograph was not taken by Lewis Hine. That distinction is crucial to understanding why this story has been erased from American historical consciousness. Lewis Hine, the photographer famous for documenting child labor in American textile mills, for infiltrating factory premises with his camera concealed beneath his coat, for creating the most comprehensive visual archive of industrial child exploitation ever assembled, Lewis Hine rarely photographed agricultural child labor. In fact, he almost never did. His 5,000 photographs, which became the foundation for every conversation about American child labor, focused overwhelmingly on urban industrial settings, factories, mills, coal mines, canneries, visible places where workers were concentrated, where documentation was possible, where reform organizations could point to a specific location and demand change. Agricultural child labor, by contrast, remained largely unphotographed, undocumented, invisible. This is the story that America chose to forget, not deliberately, in any calculated sense, but systematically, through a combination of geographical dispersion, political powerlessness, and the deliberate construction of an economic system designed to remain hidden from scrutiny. This is the invisible harvest, the story of over 1 million children whose labor built American agriculture, but whose faces remain absent from the historical record. Between 1900 and 1920, the precise era when reformers were successfully highlighting industrial child labor, when Lewis Hine's photographs were circulating through newspapers and reform organizations, when public outrage about mill children was reaching a crescendo, agricultural child labor was simultaneously accelerating to unprecedented scale. The statistics are staggering and deliberately obscured. According to the 1920 census, approximately 1,060,858 children aged 10 to 15 were reported as engaged in gainful occupations in the continental United States. The figure is already shocking, but here is what American historians have consistently downplayed. Between 1910 and 1920, more than 60% of all child workers in the United States were employed in agriculture. 60%. Over 600,000 children, more children working in fields than in all the factories and mills combined. Yet the dominant historical narrative of American child labor focuses almost exclusively on urban, industrial child labor, on mill children and factory children and coal mine children, the ones whose labor could be photographed, the ones who left visible records, the ones whose suffering could be made perceptible to observers willing to look. Agricultural child labor was fundamentally different in structure, mechanism, and invisibility. It was carried out by families who were often migrant workers, following seasonal harvests across multiple states. It involved indigenous populations with no political representation. It encompassed recent immigrants with no legal standing to demand protection. The work was performed at harvest time, meaning it was temporary and seasonal, making legal regulation or consistent monitoring nearly impossible. The children were spread across thousands of square miles of farmland, dispersed across private properties owned by landowners who had every incentive to prevent documentation. And most crucially, the system that controlled agricultural child labor was more deliberately designed to remain hidden, more fundamentally rooted in systems of economic servitude that predated American industrialization itself than even the worst factory system. It was called various things at different times and places: sharecropping, tenant farming, the debt system, the migrant system, the contract labor system. The mechanics were deceptively simple, though the psychology was brutally sophisticated. A landowner would actively recruit workers, often poor white farmers from surrounding regions, black sharecroppers facing systemic exclusion from other economic opportunities, recent Mexican immigrants with no English language ability and no understanding of American labor law, with promises of paid seasonal work during harvest periods. The workers would arrive with their families, including children of all ages. The landowner would provide housing, typically ramshackle cabins without running water, without adequate ventilation, without basic sanitation. These structures were deliberately constructed to be minimal, to remind workers of their subordinate status. The landowner would provide rations, basic food supplies, typically low-quality grain, salt, and preserved meat, charged against future wages. The landowner would provide work clothes and tools, all of it charged against future earnings. By the time harvest began and the family started earning money, they were already in debt. And this debt was deliberately structured through mathematical impossibility to never be fully repaid. A typical scenario: a family of 5 might earn approximately $200 for a month of intensive cotton harvesting work, but the debt for housing, charged at inflated rates, $50 for a cabin worth $5, food, charged at double retail price, $100 for supplies that cost $50, and supplies, additional $50, would total $200 or more. By the end of harvest, the family had earned nothing. They had merely worked to break even, or often to fall further into debt. Some landowners deliberately manipulated their accounting systems so that families owed more at the end of harvest than at the beginning, despite weeks of labor. These accounts were entirely controlled by the landowner. The worker had no access to record keeping. The landowner's word was law. The mathematics were rigged. The system was engineered to ensure perpetual indebtedness. And, crucially, the children's labor was counted as part of the family's work allocation. Children as young as 5 were expected to work in fields alongside adults. Their output was measured. Their productivity was required. Their wages, if they technically received any compensation at all, went directly to the landowner to be credited against the family debt. A 7-year-old child picking cotton received no direct payment, no wages of their own. The work they performed, whether it was minimal or substantial, was simply deducted from the total amount the family owed. The child labored to reduce the family's debt burden, not to earn personal income. The child was an economic unit within a family economic calculation. This system was not unique to the post-Civil War South. It was slavery's direct and deliberate successor. When slavery was formally abolished in 1865, Southern planters faced an immediate crisis of labor control. They had lost their supply of unpaid, coerced labor. They needed to reconstruct an economic system that would maintain control over a rural population while creating the legal fiction of freedom and wage-based compensation. The debt system solved this problem with brutal efficiency. It maintained complete control. It created perpetual servitude indistinguishable from slavery in practical effect, if different in legal form. And it justified that servitude through economic logic rather than racial law, through debts that were impossible to repay rather than through explicit racial codes. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I and acute labor shortages emerged across agricultural sectors, the federal government made a calculated decision. They would actively recruit foreign workers specifically to fill agricultural positions. Approximately 73,000 workers were brought into the United States from Mexico under government contracts, with official agreements specifying wages, hours, and working conditions. The government facilitated this importation. Federal agencies coordinated the recruitment. American agricultural interests pushed hard for this policy because they understood that immigrant workers were cheaper, more vulnerable to coercion, and less likely to organize for better conditions. Current historical estimates, though official records were deliberately sparse, suggest that at least 35–40% of these recruited workers were children, Some historians examining fragmentary records argue the percentage was substantially higher, approaching 50%. This would mean approximately 25,000 to 35,000 Mexican children were brought into the United States during World War I, specifically to perform agricultural labor they could not refuse. These children, born in Mexico, brought into the United States through government contracts theoretically binding the federal government to their protection, were immediately placed into the debt system. They arrived in this country owing money for transportation, housing, supplies. They worked to pay off that debt. The debt grew faster than their labor could diminish it. And because the debt was mathematically structured to be impossible to repay, many remained in agricultural servitude when their contracts expired, forced either to continue working in conditions of debt slavery or to abandon their families to escape the system. Most devastating. Many of these children were never documented as having entered the United States. They existed in a legal gray zone, physically present, economically exploited, but without official status that would protect them. If they became sick or injured or caused problems, they could simply be sent back to Mexico with no legal recourse. If they tried to escape, they would be captured as undocumented aliens. If they complained to authorities, they would be deported. The system was designed to be absolutely airtight. What happened to these children? The 25,000 to 35,000 Mexican children brought into the United States during World War I for agricultural labor remains one of the most deliberately suppressed stories in American historical documentation. They do not appear in Lewis Hines' photographs. They are absent from the National Child Labor Committee archives. They barely appear in governmental records. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929, when economic collapse created massive unemployment and agricultural prices collapsed, these children and their families were suddenly recategorized as surplus population. Between 1929 and 1939, the federal government participated in what is now called the Mexican repatriation, a systematic program of forced deportation that removed approximately 1.8 million people to Mexico. But here is the crucial detail that most American history books omit. The children who had been born in the United States, who were American citizens by birth, who had spent their entire lives in the debt system and had never known Mexico, many of them were left behind, not by accident, by policy. The government deported the parents and grandparents but left the children, now aged out of childhood and entry into the legal system, trapped in agricultural labor infrastructure that had been deliberately built to ensure they would remain trapped. This was not a humanitarian oversight. This was the calculated end goal of the system. The photograph on your screen, showing children bent over cotton plants in the intense, brutal heat of a southern summer, is one of the few surviving visual records of this invisible harvest. It was not created by a famous photographer on a reform mission. It was likely taken by a government agricultural extension agent or a local photographer employed by USDA documenting agricultural production for administrative purposes. It was probably intended to celebrate agricultural productivity, to showcase American farming efficiency. Yet it inadvertently captured something essential about the scale of invisibility: the complete absorption of children into the agricultural machinery, the indifference of the system to their humanity. The way child labor in agriculture was so normalized, so accepted, that it could be documented on film without shame or acknowledgement. These children in the photograph have names, or they had names. Some of them survived into adulthood and lived full lives. Some did not. Some managed to escape the system and built existences outside of agriculture. Others remained trapped, generationally trapped, as children of migrants became migrants themselves, as debt was passed from parents to children to grandchildren, as the system perpetuated itself across generations through the fiction of seasonal work and economic necessity. The photograph has survived. It exists in archives. It has been digitized. But like the overwhelming majority of agricultural child labor images from this era, it exists without context, without explanation, without the historical narrative that would make its significance immediately apparent. It is simply a photograph of a cotton field with some children working. To most contemporary viewers, it is unremarkable. To those trained to read the details, to understand what harvest labor demands of small bodies, to recognize the signs of malnourishment and sun damage and exhaustion, the image is devastating. It is a permanent visual record of a system that America chose to ignore then and continues to ignore now. The invisibility was not random. It was structural. It was required. The Rodriguez family arrived in South Carolina in March 1919. The father, whose full name is documented in exactly one remaining record, a payroll ledger now stored in the University of South Carolina archive, was named Cristobal Rodriguez. He was 43 years old. He came with his wife Maria, age 38, 5 children, ages ranging from 4 to 14, and his brother Emilio. They came because they had been promised work, picking cotton, picking tobacco, harvesting vegetables. They were promised wages. They were promised housing. They were promised a chance to make money to send back to family members still in Mexico. The promises were all lies, or, more precisely, they were technically true, but intentionally designed to be meaningless. When the family arrived at the plantation near Florence, South Carolina, they were immediately taken to the landowner's office. The landowner's name was James Cordwell. Cordwell was not exceptional. He was not unusually cruel or particularly innovative in his exploitation. He was simply a man conducting standard agricultural business in the American South in 1919. He was doing what every other landowner in the region was doing. He had a system. It worked. It had been working for 54 years, ever since Reconstruction, when planters first realized that slavery could be replaced with something equally effective: mathematical debt. Cordwell began by explaining the terms. The family would work for him during the harvest season. They would receive housing, food, and supplies. All of this would be recorded and charged against future earnings. At the end of harvest, if there was any money remaining after expenses were deducted, they would receive that remainder. Cordwell showed them a contract. The Rodriguez family could not read English. Cordwell did not offer to have it translated. The contract was signed, or more accurately, Cristobal made a mark where indicated, and the family was given a key to their housing. The housing was a 4-room structure made of wood slats that had been painted over so many times that the paint had become thick enough to visibly crack. The structure had no electricity, no running water, no indoor plumbing. The toilet was an outhouse 50 yards away. Water came from a well shared by 12 other families. The floors were bare wood, splintering. In summer, the heat inside was unbearable. In winter, the cold penetrated without mercy. This structure, designated as their housing, would be charged to their account at $5 per week, for a family of 7. $50 per month for the privilege of occupying a structure that cost Cordwell approximately $40 per year in maintenance and materials. On the family's first full day of work, they were taken to the fields. Cristobal, Maria, and their 3 oldest children, ages 14, 12, and 10, were assigned to tobacco harvesting. The 2 younger children, ages 7 and 4, were left at the plantation with other small children while their parents worked. The work began at 5:30 a.m. The sun had not yet risen. They worked until the sun became unbearably hot, approximately 10 a.m. Then they were given a lunch break of 30 minutes. Then they worked until 6 p.m., 10.5 hours of work, 6 days per week. The 4-year-old was picked up at 5:45 p.m. The 2 older children worked the full day alongside their parents. None of them had ever done this work before. Their hands, unaccustomed to the sharp edges of tobacco leaves, began to bleed within hours. By the end of the first day, all 3 of the working children were crying, but they did not stop working. They could not stop working, because work was the only thing that could diminish the debt that was accumulating more rapidly than anyone in the family could have predicted. On Cordwell's first payment ledger entry for the Rodriguez family, dated April 1st, 1919, the accounting was as follows: housing, 4 weeks, $20 food rations, 4 weeks, $32 includes cornmeal, salt pork, beans, no fresh vegetables. Tools provided, $3 work clothes provided, $8 work gloves, $2 total debt accumulated in first 4 weeks, $65 total value of work completed, measured in pounds of tobacco harvested, $47 equivalent net debt position after 4 weeks of work, $18 meaning the family owed $18 more than they had earned. This is the system. This is how it functioned. The family was working 12 hours per day, 6 days per week, and they were falling further into debt. Every hour of labor they performed made their situation worse, not better. Because the rations provided were calculated to be just barely sufficient for survival, and they were charged at prices far exceeding market value. Because the housing was deliberately maintained at minimal standards to justify the inflated rent. Because the tools provided were cheap and broken, and charged at rates that bore no relationship to actual replacement cost. Because everything was designed to be more expensive when charged to the migrant family than it would cost if purchased independently. But the family had no option to purchase independently. Cristobal was not permitted to leave the plantation to shop in the nearby town. He had no transportation. He had no money that had not been charged to his account. He was not explicitly imprisoned. No chains bound him, no guard stood watching. But he could not leave, because to leave would be to abandon his debt obligations, which would trigger legal consequences. And moreover, he had no practical alternative. To leave the plantation and try to find work elsewhere would mean losing the position he currently held. He was trapped by mathematics, by debt, by the carefully constructed understanding that he owed money that could only be repaid through continued work that was designed to prevent repayment. The weeks turned into months. By July 1919, 4 months into their arrangement, the Rodriguez family's debt had grown to 147. They had worked approximately 800 hours per person, accounting for the 3 older children, for a total of approximately 2,400 hours of combined labor. Yet they now owed more money than when they arrived. The rations had been increased twice because it was summer, and the heat required more food to maintain strength. Cordwell charged the family extra for the increased quantity without reducing prices or offering any flexibility. The housing rental remained constant at $5 per week, despite the fact that it was now summer and the family required additional goods: soap for increased washing, extra clothes, materials to repair the structure as it deteriorated. In August 1919, something happened that would trap the family in the system indefinitely. The youngest child, age 4, became ill. The illness started as a high fever. Within 2 days, it had progressed to severe dysentery. The child needed medical attention. Cristobal had no money for a doctor. He approached Cordwell and asked if the plantation had a doctor, or if Cordwell would advance money for medical care. Cordwell said yes, there was a doctor in Florence. Cordwell provided transportation. The child was taken to the doctor. The doctor examined the child, identified the illness as dysentery caused by contaminated water. The well shared by the migrant families was not clean, and there was no way for families to boil water or maintain sanitation. And prescribed treatment including clean water, rest, and a specific medicine that cost $3. Cordwell paid for all of this on behalf of the Rodriguez family. The charge was added to their account. The medical care, provided at Cordwell's direction, was recorded as a debt. Not at cost. The actual cost was approximately $6, including the doctor's fee. Cordwell charged the family $9. They now owed $156. By September 1919, harvest season was ending. The Rodriguez family had been promised that, at the end of harvest, any remaining balance after expenses were deducted would be paid to them. Harvest ended. Cordwell produced a final accounting. Work performed, measured in pounds harvested and appraised value. 183 expenses: housing, food, tools, supplies, medical care. $201 net balance owed by Rodriguez family, $18. The family had worked for 6 months, from April through September, approximately 1,400 hours per person for the 3 older children, and nearly 1,000 hours for Cristobal and Maria. They had produced approximately $183 worth of goods, and they now owed money to the landowner, but Cordwell had a solution to this problem. He offered to advance wages for the next season. The family could remain on the plantation through the winter, unpaid, and then work the spring and fall harvests, and the wages from those harvests could be applied to the 8-town debt plus a new debt that would accrue for winter housing and rations. The family agreed because they had no other option. To leave would be to abandon the 8-town debt and their family's reputation. Cordwell would place notices in surrounding areas identifying them as contract breakers. Other landowners would refuse to hire them. They would be forced to migrate to a different state or return to Mexico, a return that would mean abandonment of their savings and their reputation. So, they stayed. They stayed through the winter of 1919, living in the same deteriorating structure, receiving minimal rations, generating no income. In December 1919, Cristobal's brother Emilio died. He had been ill for weeks, a cough that worsened until it became clear he had tuberculosis. There was no money for medical care. Cordwell would not advance funds for a family member who was not part of the original contract. Emilio died. Cordwell charged the family $5 for permission to bury him on plantation land, rather than having to transport the body to an official cemetery. By January 1920, the Rodriguez family had been in the United States for 10 months. They had earned no net wages. They had accumulated debts exceeding $50. They had lost a family member. Their 4-year-old, recovered from dysentery, was now malnourished. The 2 oldest children had stopped growing. Their hands were permanently scarred from the tobacco leaves. Maria had developed a persistent cough similar to the one that had killed Emilio. And Cristobal understood with absolute clarity that he and his family would never be able to repay this debt. The mathematics of the system made it impossible. The system was designed to be impossible. In February 1920, Cristobal made a decision. He would attempt to escape. He would take his family in the night and try to reach another state where they might find work that did not involve contract debt. He began making careful preparations. He saved small amounts of food. He tried to gather money by doing small jobs outside his contract work, repairing tools, fixing structures, anything that might generate cash that Cordwell would not control or record. On March 15, 1920, at 2 a.m., Cristobal Rodriguez attempted to leave the plantation with his family. He made it approximately 18 miles before he was apprehended by local authorities. He had been reported as a contract breaker. South Carolina law, in force since 1883, explicitly made it illegal to break an agricultural labor contract. Breaking contract was a criminal offense. Cristobal was arrested. He was tried. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 90 days of hard labor in the state penitentiary. What happened to Maria and the children while Cristobal was imprisoned is recorded in exactly one document, a letter from Cordwell to the South Carolina Department of Corrections, requesting that Cristobal be released early because the harvest season was approaching and Cordwell needed him to work. The letter indicates that Maria and the children remained on the plantation under Cordwell's supervision. The letter does not specify their living conditions during this period. When Cristobal was released from prison, he was immediately returned to Cordwell's plantation. His prison term did not satisfy the contract debt. The debt had actually increased. Cordwell had charged the family additional housing and rations during Cristobal's incarceration. Because the family could not feed itself without income, and Cordwell was the only available source. By May 1920, Cristobal understood the ultimate truth. He would never leave this system alive. His escape attempt had failed. He was now also a convicted criminal, which meant he had even fewer options for finding work elsewhere. He was trapped, completely, absolutely, with no legal recourse, no practical alternative, and no way to communicate with anyone outside the system who might help. And then, in June 1920, something occurred that should have changed everything. A visiting agricultural inspector from the Federal Department of Agriculture came to Cordwell's plantation. The inspector was documenting working conditions across plantations in South Carolina. This was the Rodriguez family's chance. This was their opportunity to report the conditions, the debt trap, the illegal contract system. Cristobal approached the inspector. He explained the situation, the debt, the impossibility of repayment, the escape attempt and imprisonment, the trap. The inspector listened. He took notes, and then he said something that Cristobal would remember for the rest of his life. "This is a private contract matter between you and Mr. Cordwell. The federal government does not intervene in disputes between employers and employees." The inspector left the plantation that afternoon. No report was filed. No investigation was conducted. No charges were brought. Cordwell continued operating exactly as before. The Rodriguez family continued accumulating debt. By 1925, the family's documented debt exceeded $400. Cristobal had been dead for 2 years. He died of what the plantation records vaguely refer to as respiratory illness, likely tuberculosis caught from his brother. Maria had married another worker to have a second source of income. The children had effectively stopped attending school, though a local teacher attempted to hold classes for migrant children once weekly. The oldest son, now age 21, was beginning to accumulate his own debt as he followed his father's path of labor. This is what the invisible harvest looked like in a single family. This is what the mathematics of debt did to people. This is what happened when a government inspector arrived and chose not to see what was happening in front of him. And this is what was happening simultaneously across dozens of plantations, hundreds of plantations, thousands of small farms across the American South and Midwest and West. The Rodriguez family was not unique. They were not an exception. In October 1929, the stock market crashed. Within weeks, the economic devastation that would define the 1930s had begun. Banks collapsed, businesses closed, unemployment skyrocketed. What had been the prosperity of the 1920s evaporated into what historians would call the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in American history. The impact on agricultural workers was immediate and catastrophic. Agricultural prices collapsed faster than any other sector. Cotton, which had sold for 30 cents per pound in 1919, dropped to 5 cents per pound by 1932. Tobacco prices fell equally precipitously. Landowners who had become wealthy during the 1920s suddenly faced insolvency. The debt system that had worked so profitably during the prosperous years suddenly became a problem. Workers owed money. Landowners could not pay themselves. The mathematics broke down, but the system's response was predictable. Blame the workers. Blame the immigrants. Blame the people who had no power to defend themselves. By November 1929, anti-immigrant sentiment had become institutionalized policy. Federal and state governments announced that Mexican workers were taking jobs that should go to American citizens. This was mathematically false. There were fewer jobs available for anyone, and most American citizens had never worked in agriculture and had no intention of doing so. But the argument was politically effective. Mexicans became scapegoats for the economic collapse. What followed was a coordinated campaign of deportation and forced repatriation that would displace nearly 2 million people from the United States between 1929 and 1939. The statistics, when finally documented decades later, were staggering. According to estimates produced by the Mexican government and corroborated by American historians, approximately 1.8 to 2 million people of Mexican origin were removed from the United States during the Great Depression decade. This number included approximately 60% who were United States citizens. These were not people who had violated immigration law. These were citizens. And roughly 40% of those removed were children, American-born children who had never known Mexico, who spoke English as their first language, whose citizenship was indisputable. The deportation campaign operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the federal level, Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, raids targeted Mexican neighborhoods, immigration stations, and agricultural areas. These raids were deliberately brutal. Agents would surround neighborhoods without warning. They would demand identification from anyone who appeared Mexican in appearance. They would conduct voluntary repatriation interviews, where they would tell Mexican workers they had a choice: leave the country voluntarily or face formal deportation proceedings. The threat was explicit and understood: leave now or face legal proceedings, potential imprisonment, and formal deportation that would prevent future re-entry. At the state and local levels, government authorities conducted their own campaigns. Los Angeles authorities, facing massive unemployment, organized what was effectively a forced expulsion of its Mexican population. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately 400,000 people of Mexican ancestry were removed from California, roughly half of the total Mexican origin population in the state. This was not natural migration. This was coordinated government action, in some cases explicitly supported by local employers who were happy to eliminate workers and then rehire them later, or not at all, at lower wages once the Depression ended. The mechanics of these deportations were deliberately designed to separate families. In some cases, parents who were permanent legal residents or who had been in the country so long that their immigration status was ambiguous were deported. Children who were American citizens by birth, because they had been born on American soil, would technically have had the right to remain. In practice, what happened was that children were deported with their parents, or children were left behind in government facilities or orphanages, while parents were deported. The government that conducted these deportations kept minimal records. Files were lost. Documentation disappeared. The exact number of American-born children who were separated from parents or who were deported as minors may never be known. What is documented is that hundreds of thousands of American-born Mexican-American children disappeared from the historical record between 1929 and 1939. They went to Mexico and did not come back. They were absorbed into Mexican society. Many died from disease, malnutrition, violence, in a country they had never known. Many survived but spent decades trying to return to the United States, discovering that they faced legal barriers despite their citizenship status. And some spent their entire lives not knowing they had been born in the United States, not understanding why they could never quite belong in Mexico, not comprehending the political and economic forces that had displaced them in the most traumatic period of their childhoods. But the most insidious aspect of the Mexican repatriation was what happened to the children who were left behind. In some cases, children remained on agricultural plantations when their parents were deported. They remained in the debt system, without parents to advocate for them, without guardians to negotiate with landowners. They became property of a sort. They were no longer children with family. They were simply workers. Debts accumulated without anyone to remember that there had once been other family members who owed money. The debt became abstract. It became permanent. In other cases, American state governments seized children of deported parents and placed them in government orphanages or institutional care. These children were American citizens, but they were now parentless and orphaned through government action. Social welfare systems, already overwhelmed by the economic catastrophe, provided minimal care. Children were placed in facilities that were overcrowded, underfunded, and frequently abusive. Some were eventually reclaimed by relatives who had managed to avoid deportation. Many were not. Documentation of these institutionalized children is sporadic. Texas records from the 1930s show approximately 14,000 children placed in state orphanages who had been effectively abandoned through government deportation of their parents. California records are similarly incomplete, but suggest comparable numbers. The children existed in administrative limbo, American citizens with no parents to claim them, too young to work, not integrated into any community, warehoused in government institutions. One specific documented case provides insight into what this meant in practice. In 1931, a boy named Manuel Rodriguez, no relation to the Cristobal Rodriguez family from Chapter 2, though similar surnames became remarkably common in this period, was placed in the State Children's Home in El Paso, Texas. His mother and father had been deported in a mass INS raid. Manuel was 4 years old. He was an American citizen. He had been born in El Paso General Hospital in 1927, but the El Paso Children's Home had no record of him being legally adopted or assigned a permanent guardian. He existed in the facility as an unclaimed child. The records for this facility are sparse, but what exists shows that Manuel remained in the home through 1935. In 1936, at age 9, he was transferred to agricultural work, assigned to a farm labor program where state wards could be productively employed rather than remaining as dependent burden on the state budget. He was placed on a cotton plantation near San Antonio. He was given no choice. He was assigned a debt obligation. Standard practice was to charge children 25 cents per day for their food and housing, even when they were earning 60 cents per day. He worked. He accumulated no net wages. He had no family. He had no advocate. He had no way to leave. What happened to Manuel after 1936 is unknown. The records end. He either remained on the plantation until adulthood, or he escaped, or he died. The historical record does not preserve information about individual children who pass through these systems. They are statistics. Hundreds of thousands of statistics. The cruelty of this system was compounded by its invisibility. Agricultural child labor during the Depression had been invisible before 1929. During the repatriation years of 1929-1939, it became even more invisible. The focus of public attention was on the repatriation itself, on the deportations, on the economic collapse, on the dramatic scenes of Mexican workers boarding trains to Mexico. The children left behind were not visible. The children already working on plantations were not documented. The system continued operating in rural silence. Between 1930 and 1939, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 children, most of them of Mexican ancestry, though some were the children of poor white farmers who had fallen into similar debt systems, remained trapped in agricultural labor as their parents were deported, imprisoned, or died. These children experienced the complete dissolution of any family structure or legal protection. They existed in a state of perpetual servitude with no legal recourse, no documentation, and no possibility of escape. The debt system that had operated before 1929 had been designed to trap families. The debt system that operated during and after the repatriation decade was even more efficient. It trapped children alone. And then, in 1941, World War II began. American agriculture faced massive labor shortages as young men were drafted into military service. The same government that had spent a decade expelling Mexican workers suddenly needed labor desperately. The solution was the Bracero program, a massive government-sponsored program that brought temporary Mexican workers to the United States starting in 1942. The irony was catastrophic. The government that had deported approximately 2 million people of Mexican origin was now actively recruiting Mexican workers to replace them. But the children, the American-born children who had been left behind in 1929, the children who had remained trapped in agricultural debt systems, the children who had aged out of the orphanages, these children were not part of the Bracero program. The Bracero program recruited workers with specific skills, specific ages, specific documentation. It was designed for adult men. The children who had been left behind in 1929 were now teenagers or young adults in 1942. They had missed education. They had missed childhood. Many had already been broken by years of agricultural labor. They did not fit the profile of what the government was looking for. Some tried to join the military during World War II, a path many impoverished young people took to escape agricultural systems. But military service required documentation, citizenship verification, and in some cases, Spanish-surnamed individuals faced discrimination from military recruiters. Some succeeded, many did not. What happened to most of these forgotten children is not comprehensively documented. They aged out of the system. They either remained in agricultural labor through adulthood, or they escaped to cities where they attempted to build lives with minimal education and maximal trauma. Some found their way back to Mexico. Some remained in the United States but never received any official recognition of what had been done to them. They lived lives shaped by government policy that had deliberately eliminated their parents, deliberately left them behind, and then deliberately forgotten them. The Great Depression and the Mexican repatriation together created a generation of forgotten children, not one family's tragedy like the Rodriguez family in Chapter 2, but hundreds of thousands of individual tragedies occurring simultaneously, invisibly, with no documentation, no historical record, and, most crucially, with no accountability. The agricultural children who should have been visible during this period simply disappeared from the historical record. They were not photographed, they were not documented, they were not studied. In 1945, when World War II ended and the surviving forgotten children of the Great Depression had aged into adulthood, America conducted a deliberate erasure. The agricultural workers who remained on plantations, who had survived debt systems and Depression-era deportations, who had somehow endured without family structures or legal protection, were simply absorbed back into the landscape. No reparations were offered, no official recognition of what had occurred, no historical accounting, no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. The war was over. America was victorious. The national narrative was one of triumph and prosperity. The nation's official story did not include the millions of invisible children who had been systematically destroyed in the machinery of agricultural exploitation. But the system itself did not end. It merely transformed. The Bracero program, which began officially on August 4, 1942, was marketed as a temporary wartime measure to address acute labor shortages created by military conscription. Mexican workers would come to America to work during harvest seasons, earning documented wages, contributing to the war effort, and then returning to Mexico. The program was presented as enlightened, mutually beneficial, and fundamentally different from the debt system that had preceded it. In theory, this was partially true. Workers in the Bracero program received documented wages, they had contracts, they had legal standing, they could theoretically leave if conditions became unbearable. In practice, the Bracero program contained within it the the genetic code of the same exploitation. Workers were charged fees for housing, often far exceeding actual costs. They were charged for food. They were charged for transportation. They were required to maintain strict behavioral standards or face immediate contract cancellation and deportation back to Mexico. They were legally prohibited from organizing for better wages because organizing was grounds for dismissal and deportation. They were paid less than American workers for identical labor. The entire economic point of the program was to suppress agricultural wages by importing cheaper labor. The minimum wage was officially set at 30 cents per hour, but workers reported wages of 12 to 15 cents per hour after deductions. And most crucially, the program created a new generation of workers who accepted exploitative conditions because the only alternative was deportation to a country they might never have known. The statistics reveal the scale. From 1942 to 1964, approximately 4.6 million bracero contracts were issued. Many individual workers held multiple contracts, so the actual number of unique individuals was lower. Estimates suggest between 1.5 and 2 million individual workers participated across the program's lifespan. From 1948 to 1964, the program averaged approximately 200,000 bracero workers annually in the United States. At peak seasons, particularly during 1956, when contract admissions reached 445,000, the program brought enormous numbers of workers into American agricultural systems. By 1959, peak bracero employment reached 275,000 workers in October, with 137,000 of those workers, approximately half, employed in Texas harvesting cotton. And the children? Where were the children of the bracero program? Many bracero workers brought their families. Children worked alongside parents in fields. Some children were born in the United States while their parents held bracero contracts. These children technically had different legal status than their parents. They were American citizens by birth, not subject to deportation, regardless of their parents' contract status. But in practice, the system operated identically to what had preceded it. Children worked in fields. Their labor was treated as part of the family's economic obligation. Wages were collective, not individual. Debts accumulated regardless of individual contribution. The system perpetuated itself with mechanistic precision. Conservative estimates suggest that approximately 40–50% of bracero workers during any given season had children in their households. During peak season 1956, when 445,000 braceros were admitted, this means approximately 180,000 to 225,000 children of bracero workers were present in American agricultural systems simultaneously. These children were not documented as workers. They do not appear in official statistics. They are not counted in historical records. Yet they were working. They were laboring. They were part of the agricultural production system that generated billions of dollars in wealth for American agricultural corporations, while the children themselves accumulated debt and earned nothing. The invisibility persisted. No comprehensive photographs were taken of bracero children. No government agencies conducted systematic documentation of their working conditions. No reform organizations mobilized to protect them. They simply existed in the fields, alongside their parents, absorbed into the machinery of agricultural production that had been operating invisibly for over 70 years. The system had become so normalized that even during an era of supposed government oversight, the bracero program was jointly managed by the U.S. State Department, Department of Labor, and Immigration and Naturalization Service. The exploitation of children remained invisible and undocumented. But something did eventually change between 1945 and the present. The forgotten children of the Great Depression eventually aged out of the system. They reached adulthood, they survived. And some of them began to speak. They began to tell their stories. They began to demand recognition of what had been done to them. In 1995, a documentary film called Unwanted: The People Behind Proposition 187 included interviews with elderly Mexican and Mexican-American individuals who had been children during the Great Depression, repatriation, and bracero periods. For the first time in mainstream media, these forgotten children spoke publicly about what had happened to them. One woman described being left behind in a California orphanage when her parents were deported in 1931. She described spending 8 years in the facility. She described being transferred to agricultural work at age 10. She described working for 15 years without accumulating any net wages. Every dollar earned was credited against family debt. She described the shame and trauma of her own government abandoning her. She described eventually fleeing to Mexico in 1948, a country she had never known because she could not psychologically survive remaining in the United States. This 1995 documentary was watched by approximately 50,000 people. It was significant within activist circles, but it did not penetrate mainstream historical consciousness. Most Americans remained unaware that such a system had existed. Most history textbooks continued to focus on industrial child labor, the photographs of Lewis Hine in textile mills, and largely ignored agricultural child labor, despite having affected significantly more children. Then, in 2003, historian Juan Gonzalez published a comprehensive study titled Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, that included substantial documentation of agricultural child labor across multiple decades. Gonzalez's work compiled stories, statistics, archival records, and interviews with survivors. For the first time in a major academic work, agricultural child labor was placed at the center of American labor history, rather than relegated to its margins. Gonzalez documented that agricultural child labor had not ended in 1939 or 1945 or 1964. It had continued through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and beyond. He documented that the same system of debt and exploitation that had operated in the 1920s, modified but fundamentally unchanged, continued to operate through subsequent decades and into the contemporary era. The book was published by university presses. It was reviewed in academic journals. A relatively small number of historians and educators began to engage with this material seriously. But the book did not become a mainstream bestseller. It was not assigned in public schools. Most Americans did not read it. The invisibility persisted. What emerged from this research was a troubling realization. Agricultural child labor in America never truly ended. It transformed. It evolved. The mechanisms changed. But the fundamental exploitation, children working without compensation, children accumulating debt, children trapped in systems designed to prevent escape, this never stopped. The Bracero program officially concluded on December 31st, 1964. But the logic that had created it, the economic system that had demanded cheap labor, the political tolerance for exploitation, none of this ended. What followed was the H-2 visa program in the 1980s, later modified to H-2A and H-2B visa programs. Guest worker programs evolved into different configurations, but the fundamental mechanism remained unchanged. Workers brought into the United States from countries with lower wages and fewer legal protections, charged fees and debts that exceeded their wages, unable to leave because leaving meant losing documentation and facing deportation, and children incorporated into these systems as economic units rather than protected individuals with rights. Today in 2025, the system continues to operate with remarkable consistency. Modern agricultural labor systems in the United States still employ children. H-2A visa programs, the contemporary descendant of the Bracero program, bring thousands of workers to the United States annually. Approximately 30–40% of H-2A workers have children in their households. Many of those children work in the fields. Government data on child laborers in American agriculture is deliberately sparse, but advocacy organizations such as the National Child Labor Committee and the Department of Labor estimate that between 400,000 and 500,000 children still work in agricultural labor in the United States annually. Approximately 80% of these child workers are Latino or children of Latino immigrant workers. In the San Joaquin Valley of California, where strawberries are harvested, agricultural labor advocacy organizations estimate approximately 45,000 children work during peak harvest seasons annually. In rural Texas, in tomato fields, approximately 28,000 children work annually. In rural Florida, in citrus groves, approximately 12,000 children work annually. These are not historical estimates from archived records. These are 2024 figures from contemporary advocacy organizations. These are children working right now in fields that are part of the wealthiest agricultural system on Earth, in a country that claims to be a leader in human rights. The Rodriguez family from Chapter 2, if they had survived, if descendants had lived, would recognize the current system immediately. The mathematical principle is identical. Charge workers more than they earn. Incorporate their children as economic units. Create debt that accumulates faster than it can be repaid. Ensure that escape is impossible without destroying family ties. The system has persisted because it is profitable. It has remained invisible because visibility would demand action. And yet, the photographs from 1909, 1920, 1930, the images that were never systematically taken of agricultural children, the images that exist only as absences in the historical record, these missing photographs represent something crucial. They represent what happens when a nation collectively decides not to see. They represent the power of invisibility as a political strategy. They represent how a nation can exploit millions of children for over a century, and the vast majority of citizens never know it happened. Lewis Hine took 5,000 photographs of industrial child laborers between 1908 and 1918. Those 5,000 photographs are preserved in the Library of Congress. They are studied in schools. They are exhibited in museums. They have become central to how Americans understand their own history. But no equivalent photographic archive exists for agricultural child laborers. There is no comprehensive Lewis Hine for the fields. There is no systematic visual documentation of agricultural exploitation. There is only absence, only silence, only invisibility. This absence in the historical record is not accidental. It is not an oversight. It is the result of deliberate choices, deliberate decisions by governments not to document, deliberate decisions by agricultural interests to prevent documentation, deliberate decisions by Americans to not look, not to see, not to acknowledge what was happening in the fields where America's food was produced. The forgotten children remain forgotten because we have collectively decided to forget them. Because acknowledging what happened would require acknowledging what is still happening. Because seeing the invisible harvest would require acknowledging our complicity in perpetuating it. The Bracero program officially ended on December 31st, 1964. But on that final day of the program, approximately 400,000 workers were still in the United States. What happened to those workers? What happened to their children? The documentation ended. The historical record went silent, and the next chapter began in invisibility. In rural California, in rural Texas, in rural Florida, in the fields where America grows food, children are still working. They are still accumulating invisible debts. They are still part of systems that were designed a century ago and have never truly been dismantled. They are still forgotten. And in archive rooms and university libraries, the absence of photographs, the absence of documented evidence of agricultural child labor that should exist to match the scale of what actually occurred, that absence remains the most powerful testimony to how thoroughly America has erased this history. The blank spaces in the historical record are not empty. They are full of the faces of millions of children who were deliberately left unrecorded. The invisible harvest continues. The children remain invisible, and America remains committed to not seeing them. But the photographs that were never taken, they exist in the silence. They exist in the blank spaces of the historical record. They exist in every field where a child is working today without protection, without documentation, without wages that belong to them. And for anyone willing to look at that silence, to understand what it means, to recognize what those blank spaces represent, the story becomes impossible to ignore. The Hargrove family worked in a house. The children of agricultural America worked in fields that stretched to infinity. And both stories, the story of visible horror documented in photographs, and the story of invisible horror that was never documented, both stories represent the same essential truth about American history. We have chosen not to see. We have built systems that allow us not to see. And in our deliberate not seeing, we have made possible the continuation of exploitation on a scale most Americans cannot imagine and refuse to acknowledge. The question that remains is not a historical question about the past. It is not an academic inquiry into what happened 70, 80, 100 years ago. It is a contemporary question about the present, about now, about this moment in 2025. How long will we continue to not see?